The knife was still warm when Merritt Harker drove it into the ice. Not warm from any fire, not warm from any sun. The sky above the Arctic Range was the color of old pewter, and it had been that color for 3 days running, and the wind that moved through the Nordvik Pass carried the kind of cold that didn't negotiate. The knife was warm because it had lived inside Harker's jacket against his ribs for 11 hours of movement through that cold. It was warm because a human body had kept it warm. And now the human body that had stood beside him for 4 years was somewhere under 2 meters of compacted snow and ice, and the knife was the only marker they had. He drove it in blade down, handle up. That was the way men in his line of work marked the places where the good ones fell. 6 men stood behind him. Nobody spoke. Nobody looked directly at the mound. The mound was approximately 3 meters wide and 2 meters deep at its highest point, a compressed wave of white that had come down off the eastern ridge in one catastrophic exhale 41 hours ago. It had taken the ridgeline with it. It had taken the hide position. It had taken the ghillie-wrapped silhouette that had been covering their retreat through the pass. It had taken Nora Vance in 4 seconds. Harker stood over the handle of the knife and did not move for a long time. The wind came in from the northeast in flat, sustained sheets carrying fine ice crystals that cut exposed skin the way ground glass would, moving across the snowfield with a sound that was almost musical, almost patient, like something that had been doing this for 10,000 years and intended to keep doing it long after every human being on the slope was gone. He had stood over 17 places like this in 15 years. He knew what a real grave felt like. This one felt wrong. He could not have explained why, and he was not a man who trusted things he couldn't explain, which made the feeling worse. There was nothing in the mound that suggested anything other than what it was. There was nothing in the silence of the mountain that differed from the silence of any other mountain. There was no logical basis for the specific wrongness that had settled in his chest when he drove the knife in and stepped back. But it was there. Sergeant First Class Kowalski appeared at his left shoulder. Kowalski had a face built for bad weather, angular and windburned, with pale eyes that processed terrain the way a compass processed magnetic north, constantly, automatically, without drama. "She's really gone," Sir Kowalski said. It wasn't a question. It was the kind of statement a man makes when he needs to hear the words leave his own mouth before he can file them correctly. Harker didn't answer. Private Garrett, the youngest on the team, was standing at the edge of the mound with his rifle slung and his hands at his sides. He was 24 years old and had seen things in the last 2 years that aged him considerably past that number, but he had not seen this before. His jaw was tight, and he was working to keep his face neutral, and he was mostly succeeding. Staff Sergeant Raymond Briggs, 12 years and 4 of them, with Harker, stepped forward and handed him the radio log. "Missing in action," Briggs said quietly. "Presumed killed." Harker took the log. He looked at the line. He initialed it. He looked at the knife handle rising from the snow. The small compass etched into the pommel caught the gray light and threw a pale reflection across the white surface. He had carried that knife since a deployment not officially on record in a country that officially had nothing to do with him. He had driven it into frozen ground once before in a different mountain range, in different weather over a different mound. He had not retrieved it that time. He would retrieve this one. He did not know why he was certain of that. "She doesn't get across?" Garrett asked. His voice was careful, as though he understood he might be stepping into something he didn't fully understand. "She gets the knife," Harker said. Garrett absorbed that. He nodded once slowly with the deference of someone who recognizes that a custom exists even if he doesn't yet know the full weight of it. "Move out," Harker said. "We're needed at staging." Nobody argued. They filed back through the pass in single file, following boot prints that were already beginning to fill with drifting powder. The wind worked at the mound behind them. Within the hour, the surface would be smooth. Within the day, the knife handle itself might disappear under new accumulation. Harker walked at the rear of the column and did not look back. Not because the grief was too large. He had managed grief before and would manage it again. He didn't look back because something in him, the part that had survived 15 years by trusting things he could not articulate, was still listening to the mountain. And the mountain was not giving him the silence of a grave. It was giving him something else entirely. He could not name it. He kept walking. 3 hours later, in the staging area 12 kilometers south of the Nordvik Pass, Harker sat across from a satellite image and tried to keep his mind on the living. There were 4 of them. Lieutenant Aldrich and his reconnaissance element from the 3rd Alpine Battalion had gone dark 17 hours ago. Last confirmed transmission had placed them in the Arctic Valley, a natural bowl in the granite range with walls rising on 3 sides and a single viable approach corridor from the north. The weather between staging and the valley was deteriorating. A Category 4 whiteout was building from the northeast, expected to close the passes within 6 hours and hold for 48 after that. The intelligence officer, a thin woman named Captain Morse, laid the satellite image on the table with the precision of someone who knew the weight of what they were presenting. Last known position is here, she said. Valley floor approximately 200 meters east of an old fire observation post. We believe Aldrich's element sheltered there when the first front hit. They had rations for 4 days. They had one radio. She paused. The radio battery was rated for 48 hours in these temperatures. They've been out there for 17. Harker looked at the image. He had walked similar terrain in similar conditions, and he knew what 17 hours without communication meant. It didn't necessarily mean dead. It meant cold hungry, possibly injured, certainly cut off from any picture of what was coming to help them. Or not coming. The problem, Morse said. She pointed to the eastern rim of the valley bowl. Ghost of the Ridge. Harker had heard the call sign. Everyone who operated in these mountains had heard it. An enemy sniper, origin unknown, working the high passes for 8 weeks. 7 confirmed kills, all long-range engagements, all in low-visibility, high-wind conditions. He picks his days, Morse said. When the conditions favor him, they're wrong for everyone else. He's never been fixed. Every engagement he relocates before any acoustic signature can be triangulated. Longest confirmed shot, Harker asked. 2,800 meters. Suppressed system, possibly Russian. Platform never precisely identified. Harker looked at the approach corridor on the image. 40 meters wide at its narrowest point. A shooter on the eastern rim would have unobstructed sight lines down the entire length. Anyone trying to reach the valley floor would be exposed for the full transit. The western face was vertical granite. The southern approach would add 9 hours time they didn't have. He pulled the team roster toward him. Kowalski, he said. Flynn, Garrett, Briggs. He paused. He needed a medic. Aldrich's people had been out there without support for 17 hours, and Harker was not naive enough to expect them uninjured. Doc Thorne, he said. Sergeant Elaine Thorne was the team's field medic, compact, deliberate, and quietly excellent at the kind of work that meant the difference between someone making it to a surgical facility and someone not. She had been on 3 previous mountain insertions with Harker and had never once required direction on what to do when she reached a casualty. He had worked with noisier medics and less reliable ones, and he trusted her the way he trusted good equipment, completely and without ceremony. That was 5. He needed communications. His finger stopped on a name. Staff Sergeant Trent Decker. Decker had been with the unit for 14 months, assigned through standard rotation. Background check clean. Performance reviews adequate, not exceptional, never exceptional. Communications specialist, reliable with hardware, good at operational protocols, good at being precisely unremarkable in every review cycle. Harker had noticed the unremarkableness before and had not acted on it because adequate men existed and were assigned places, and you didn't run an investigation on a man simply for failing to distinguish himself. But somewhere in his operational memory, below the threshold of actionable concern, the notation had registered. Decker, he said, and wrote the name. He added Corporal Whitfield as the 7th steady, experienced, dependable in terrain, and then looked at the completed list with the specific discomfort of a man who has noticed something he cannot yet name. 7 people, the same number who had stood over Nora Vance's mound. He noticed it. He said nothing. Before the briefing ended, Harker found himself standing alone in the corner of the staging hut with a cup of cold coffee and a thought he was having difficulty setting down. He was thinking about what he knew about Nora Vance, not the file. He knew the file. The file was accurate, but it was also, like all files of reduction, a person rendered into verified data points, which was useful for administration and useless for understanding what you had actually lost. What he knew was different. She was 29 years old. She had been attached to his unit for 4 years, which was longer than most. Her confirmed long-range engagement record stood at 2,940 meters, established in a mountainous border region during an interdiction mission that officially had not taken place. She spoke 3 languages, German, Norwegian, and enough Russian to work with captured documentation and used none of them conversationally. Language for Nora Vance was a tool. She used it the way she used everything, precisely and only as much as the situation required. She had a scar along her left jawline from a fragment hit in a training accident that no one had fully explained to him. She had a habit of clicking her tongue twice before a difficult shot, a small unconscious sound barely audible that most people working with her for the first time never noticed. He had noticed it in the 3rd week. He had never told her because pointing it out would have bothered her in a way he couldn't have justified, but could have predicted. She had never once requested relief from a position. Not in cold, not in extended deployments, not after the fragment hit, not after any of the 6 operations that had pushed her team beyond parameters that most units would have cited as grounds for rotation. She told you what she needed. She told you wind speed and hold distances and whether a target was going to break left before he moved. She did not tell you what she wanted. 4 years and he did not know what she wanted because she had never offered that information and he had never pressed for it. He finished the coffee and walked back to his team. The briefing on Ghost of the Ridge lasted 12 minutes. Harker kept it to what mattered. The valley, the approach corridor, the engagement pattern, the suppressed platform, the relocation behavior that had kept the shooter invisible for 8 weeks. He picks his days, Harker repeated, because the phrase mattered. He's not reactive. He's not defending a position. He chooses when conditions favor him, and he works them with complete discipline. He's patient. Kowalski studied the approach corridor, 40 meters at the choke point, and the alternatives. Harker said nothing. The alternatives were the map. The map was the answer. Flynn, a lean, quiet specialist who had survived 2 previous operations in these mountains, looked at the image for a long time. Then he said, "If we move spread and use the rock shelf on the western side as partial concealment, we might reach the first formation before he has clean solutions on all of us." Partial concealment against a shooter who reaches 2,800 meters in low visibility, Harker said. Flynn nodded. That's what I said. Partial. It was not a good set of options. It was the only set. Harker didn't soften this. His team were professionals, and they understood the situation, and they did not need it managed for them. 6 hours before the whiteout becomes impassable, he said. If Aldrich's people are alive now, they will not be alive in 48 hours. The temperature in that valley at night without resupply. He let the arithmetic finish itself. Gear check at 1400. Wheels up at 15. They inserted via helicopter to a position 4 kilometers north of the valley entrance, beyond the estimated engagement range of Ghost of the Ridge. The pilots worked the rotors low and fast using the terrain contours to minimize acoustic signature. The drop took 9 seconds. Then the bird was climbing away into the gray sky, and the 7 of them were standing in thigh-deep powder with the mountains pressing in from all sides, and the silence returning like something briefly displaced and now reasserting its claim. Temperature -22. Wind sustained 12 knots from the northeast, better than it had been, but not good. Above them, the high ridges were already disappearing into the leading edge of the incoming weather system. The northern sky had taken on the flat, textureless look of serious accumulation. 6 hours, Harker thought. 6 hours, and then the door closes. Kowalski took point. They moved in spread formation, 5 meters between each person, weapons up bayes on the high ground, following a route Harker had mapped from the satellite imagery, and that Kowalski was now reading in real terrain with the quiet competence that made him the best point man Harker had ever worked alongside. The snow absorbed sound. Their footsteps made nothing. Their breathing made pale threads that the wind dissolved. Radio communication was reduced to 3-word bursts on a rotating frequency. Even encrypted signals could be detected by direction-finding equipment if the operator was good, and Ghost of the Ridge had demonstrated over 8 weeks that he was neither careless nor unsophisticated. They moved for 2 hours. Harker watched the eastern ridges, the outcroppings that offered elevation and concealment, the natural saddles that created stable shooting platforms, the shadow lines where a ghillie-wrapped silhouette would become part of the rock and stay there for hours without detection. He watched and saw nothing, which told him only that Ghost of the Ridge was either not yet positioned or was better at concealment than the terrain suggested. Neither interpretation was comforting. The valley entrance came into view at hour 2. Kowalski raised a fist. Everyone stopped. The corridor was exactly what the imagery had shown, a 40-meter gap in the granite walls, the only viable approach to the valley floor. On the eastern side, the ridge rose sharply, offering 300 vertical meters of elevated terrain with complete sight lines down every meter of the corridor. The western side was lower but still steep with limited cover. East Ridge, Kowalski murmured. 11 o'clock from the corridor entrance. He'll be up high, Harker said quietly. Anyone who crosses that ground is in his lane. All of it. Then we work left, Briggs said. Use the rock shelf. 2-second rushes. They began moving toward the western shelf, tight pairs with covering stops between. The wind was picking up, coming in gusts that rattled frozen brush on the slope above them. Between gusts, the silence was complete and cold. Harker kept his eyes on the eastern ridge. He was still watching when the first shot came. The best shots don't announce themselves. A less experienced man might have registered the impact before understanding what it was. A tiny geyser of ice crystals erupting 2 centimeters in front of Garrett's left boot. A disturbance in the air that arrived and was gone before it could be fully processed. Garrett stumbled backward. His boot caught on a buried rock, and he went down hard on one knee, rifle swinging up on instinct. Range shot, Harker said. Down. Now. They went flat. Snow filled his mouth and pressed against his goggles, and the cold hit the back of his neck with the efficiency of something designed specifically for that purpose. He cleared his airway, pressed his chin to the snow, and listened. Wind. The creak of frozen rock somewhere above. Nothing that gave him a direction, a distance, anything to work with. The shot had come from the eastern ridge, and the mountain had swallowed every acoustic clue. Suppressed round. No muzzle flash. No report echo. Ghost of the Ridge had announced himself with a calibration round, which meant the second shot would be on target. The second shot came 4 seconds later. It took Flynn in the left shoulder, the centimeter of exposed layer between vest and collar that existed in any combat load, regardless of how carefully fitted. Flynn made no sound. He went down sideways with the economy of someone who has been hit before. And knows that noise does not change the math. Thorne was across to him in a combat crawl before Harker finished processing the impact location. Through and through, Thorne said. 14 seconds later. He's mobile. The third shot didn't come. That was worse. Waiting is its own kind of dying. In the snow behind the western rock shelf, with 6 people flat and 1 bleeding, and the corridor 40 meters away, and the shooter somewhere above in silence, the waiting worked exactly as designed. Ghost was either relocating or letting time and cold do his work. Both options were equally bad. Harker counted variables. 1 enemy shooter position unknown, elevated controlling the only approach. 4 soldiers alive in the valley maybe. The whiteout building from the north. 0 fire support. 7 people behind a rock shelf with a man down. His team sniper had been buried under an avalanche 3 days ago. He had a 7.62 rifle and a very poor set of options. We need smoke, he said. Wind will diffuse it in 4 seconds at current gust rate, Kowalski said. Then we move in 4 seconds or less. Briggs's voice was flat. We can't make the corridor in 4 seconds from here. Harker knew that. He was running the secondary options, the tertiary options, looking for an angle that made 4 seconds into something viable when the shot came. It didn't come from above. It came from the left. From the high southern ridge, a direction none of them had been watching because the southern ridge made no operational sense. Wrong side of the mountain. Wrong angle for any engagement on the corridor. Wrong location for any shooter who had spent 8 weeks establishing a pattern on the eastern approaches. The crack arrived half a second after the impact point on the eastern ridge. Harker's mind ran the numbers automatically. Half a second at altitude at these temperatures. Sound at approximately 330 meters per second. The delay was longer than that. He had heard it wrong through wind and terrain. He looked at the eastern ridge. Ghost of the Ridge was no longer a problem. The silhouette that had been a shooter's was now a shape in the snow at the ridge's edge, visible for a fraction of a second before the wind shifted the snow curtain and covered it. He had not fallen dramatically. He had simply ceased to be upright with the absolute irreversibility of a shot executed to its conclusion. Harker stared at the southern ridge. White granite. Wind-scoured snowfields. Empty ski. Kowalski was already computing and his voice had lost its operational flatness entirely. Southern ridge. That is at minimum 3,200 meters. Probably more. You cannot make that shot. Not on a stationary target. Not in a crosswind. Not at this altitude. Somebody just did, Thorne said quietly. Harker's hand found his radio. His thumb settled on the transmit button. He did not press it. Whatever was on that southern ridge had just saved all 7 of them. You didn't announce yourself to something you didn't understand. You listened. The wind died. Not gradually. It stopped the way wind sometimes stops in mountain terrain, completely between gusts, for a window so brief it registered as silence rather than calm. In that window, cutting through the sudden absence of sound from somewhere south and above, they heard it. 2 short pulses. A pause. 1 long. A pause. 2 short again. Harker's blood went cold, then hot, then cold again. He knew that pattern. He had not heard it in 72 hours. He had initialed a radio log that said missing in action, presumed killed, and driven a knife into frozen ground, and now the pattern was in his earpiece, and his chest, in the specific place where rational thought normally lived, had gone briefly and completely offline. That's Briggs started, don't, Harker said. Captain, that's her signal. I said, don't. His voice was not loud. It had the quality of a door closing And in years of working with men who understood what closed doors meant in the field, it ended the conversation completely. He was already moving. The signal came again, same pattern, same direction, pulling them along the base of the western wall, where the terrain offered natural cover, and the approach minimized exposure to any secondary threat they hadn't yet identified. Whoever was up there knew exactly where they were, knew how to lead them without exposing them, knew the difference between a direction signal and a target acquisition. Harker did not allow himself to think the name. He moved on instinct because instinct was what remained when reason turned to static, and his reason was currently producing static at a rate that made it temporarily unreliable. He followed the western wall. Behind him, 6 men followed without question. The path climbed in a way that was not visible from below a series of natural rock steps buried under 6 inches of powder cut into the cliff face by water, and centuries of freeze-thaw cycling invisible from any angle except the one they were now standing at. He would not have found it in 3 hours of searching. The mountain had kept it the way mountains kept everything that mattered in plain sight of the people who knew where to look and completely hidden from everyone else. Kowalski went up first, then Flynn managing the shoulder wound with the careful economy of someone working around damage without surrendering to it. Thorne stayed close. The others followed. Harker went last, watching the approaches behind them, watching the southern face where the signal had originated and where nothing was now visible but white granite and the thin gray light of a mountain afternoon burning toward evening. The path curved left around a granite outcropping and opened into a depression in the rock, a natural hollow. The cliff curved inward, creating a space perhaps 4 meters deep and 6 wide, sheltered from the wind on 3 sides. The temperature dropped 4 degrees from the mere absence of wind, which at -22 meant almost nothing in absolute terms and everything in relative ones. After the sustained assault of the open slope, it felt like stepping inside. At the back of the hollow, barely visible against the dark rock, was a human shape, seated, back against stone, legs extended, a rifle across the thighs, not the H&H 408 that Harker knew, not the weapon he had seen Nora Vance carry for 4 years, but something longer and heavier with a suppressor that added 15 centimeters to an already substantial barrel. The figure was covered in strips of material, ghillie wrap cut into sections, some used as binding on the left arm, some draped across the shoulders in something that was half camouflage and half improvised insulation. Head leaned back against the rock, eyes open, covered in blood. Briggs moved forward first and went to one knee. He stayed there for a long time, and then he said 2 words in the careful, flat voice of a man who has learned that emotion makes field reports inaccurate. "She's breathing." Harker crossed the hollow in 4 steps. He crouched in front of her and looked, and she looked back at him, and the specific quality of that moment, the looking and the looking back, was something he would carry for the rest of his life without ever finding adequate words for it. Nora Vance's right eye was swollen completely shut. The tissue around the orbital rim had gone deep purple-black. Not a cut or a graze, but a direct impact from something heavy and fast, ice or rock or both, traveling at the velocity a pressure wave generates when several tons of snow and frozen earth come off a ridgeline at once. The right eye was functionally gone behind swelling that would take days to resolve and damage that required imaging to fully assess. Her left eye was open. It held the same quality it had always held, a flat, deliberate steadiness, like someone looking through a scope rather than at a person. Like someone who had already calculated the distance and the wind and was simply waiting for conditions to align. There was blood on the left side of her face from a scalp laceration above the temple, frozen in a dark streak from hairline to jaw. Her left arm was held against her torso in a makeshift sling fashioned from ghillie wrap strips, lashed with the careful tension of someone who understood fracture management without having anyone to help them apply that understanding. The radius was broken visibly, definitively, the angle of the bone ends readable through the lashing without palpation. She had said it herself. She had been alive under that snow for 72 hours. She had set a transverse fracture of the radius with one functioning hand and material stripped from her own ghillie wrap. She had climbed to the southern ridge with one functioning eye and a rifle she had acquired from somewhere Harker could not yet account for. And she had made the shot, 3,200 meters at minimum in a crosswind at altitude. She looked at him. "You buried my rifle," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried its characteristic quality, flat, unornamented, precise. "We buried what we thought was you," Harker said. "That was a $12,000 system." He stared at her. "I want it back," she said. Something in his chest that had been wound to a tension he'd been managing by not acknowledging it came undone at a single point. He looked away for exactly 2 seconds at the rock wall, at the gray light coming through the hollow entrance, at nothing in particular. Then he looked back. Thorn, he said. Thorn was already moving. She worked fast and said little. Saline flush on the scalp laceration. It opened briefly, and Nora's jaw tightened, but she made no sound. Penlight examination of both eyes. The right eye was not lost. Thorn determined the orbital rim had absorbed significant impact, but the globe appeared intact. Vision reduced to shadows behind the swelling, but potentially recoverable with proper treatment. The left eye was fully functional. It had been fully functional when she made the shot. The arm was the operational problem. Thorn examined the self-applied splint with the attention of a professional appraising another professional's work, and she was quiet for a moment before she said, "You did this yourself. Nobody else was there." Nora said, "Does it hurt?" A pause of approximately 1 second. "Of course it hurts. I need to realign it." "Do it." The same delivery she used for wind calls and distance readings. Every variable in the environment treated as something to be addressed rather than experienced. Thorn realigned the fracture. Nora's breath came out through her teeth in a single controlled hiss. Her right hand found the rock beside her, and her fingers pressed flat against the stone white at the knuckles. And then the hiss ended, and she was still again, with the quality of something that had passed through a defined point of intensity and come out the other side. Harker sat back against the opposite wall and assembled the picture from available pieces. She had been in her elevated position on the eastern approach when the avalanche triggered. The snow wall had come down on the eastern side of the ridge, not directly on her position, which had been further west, but close enough that the pressure wave reached her. The lateral force of that wave at her distance from the main slide mass would have been sufficient to launch a prone shooter off at a ridgeline entirely. The western face of the Nordavik Pass ridge dropped 20 to 30 meters before the first significant ledge. She had fallen that distance. The arm had broken in the fall before any burial. The orbital impact had come from the pressure wave itself, something traveling at speed hitting the right side of her face at the moment of displacement. She had landed on the western slope and been partially buried by secondary snow movement, not the catastrophic compression they had assumed, but enough coverage that freeing herself required time and method. 30 minutes, he calculated, maybe 40, working with one functional hand and a boot knife in compacted but not fully set snow. And then she had been out. No radio destroyed in the fall, no primary weapon. Emergency kit, partially intact water. Purification fire, start a thermal blanket the size of a folded playing card, a first aid kit built for lacerations and tourniquets, but not transverse radius fractures. 400 rounds of 3.38 Lapua Magnum in a zippered pouch that had somehow survived every meter of the fall. "Where did you get the rifle?" Kowalski asked. He was crouched at the edge of the hollow, studying the weapon across her thighs with visible concentration. Nora glanced at him. Ghost of the Ridge had a secondary hide on the southern summit. He'd been using it for 6 weeks ration wrappers going back to October. He cached a weapon there. "You used an enemy rifle," Briggs said. "I used what was available," Nora said. She looked at Kowalski with the eye that was working. "The platform is Russian. 338 Lapua. Long suppressor." He modified the trigger group lighter pull, then factory-consistent brake. She paused. "It's quite good." Kowalski looked at her for a moment. 3,200 meters, he said, with the particular tone of someone who has verified an outcome that his technical knowledge insists should not exist. 3,340, Nora said. "I had time to range it precisely." Nobody spoke. Garrett was watching her with the open attention of someone who has not yet learned to keep that kind of attention off their face. Briggs had the expression of a man revising a significant number of prior assumptions simultaneously. Even Thorn finishing the splint work had the quality of someone performing a physical task while their mind occupied a completely different location. Harker watched Nora across the hollow and thought about the arithmetic of what she had described. A secondary hide located 2 weeks prior and filed as a contingency, a rifle she had never handled before, assessed and deployed to make the longest shot any of them had ever witnessed. She had found the hide with one functioning eye and a broken arm after 72 hours of solo survival. She had climbed there not in response to an immediate need, but in anticipation of a need not yet materialized, because she had understood without communication, without coordination, that Harker would come for the people in the valley, and that when he did, Ghost of the Ridge would be waiting. "Cole's element," Nora said, shifting her gaze to Harker. "There are 4 of them in the valley, 3 mobile, one with a leg wound upper thigh, not arterial based on what I observed through the scope, but he needs treatment. Ghost contained them 2 days ago." He engaged once to establish range, then held the valley entrance and waited for extraction. Classic containment. She paused. He won't be doing that anymore. We move when Thorn is finished, Harker said. I'm coming, Nora said. He looked at her, at the arm, at the sealed eye, at the 72 hours written across every visible surface of her. He didn't argue. 4 years had given him a reliable sense of which conversations with Nora Vance produced different outcomes and which ones simply cost time. They moved at 1400 hours with the whiteout building behind them, like a wall being constructed by something that did not intend to stop. Nora walked at Harker's left. The Russian rifle was slung across her back. Her right hand was free. She moved more slowly than he knew her to move, but she moved steadily, and the steadiness was not performance. It was the result of a calculation about what the body had remaining and how to allocate it without waste. He waited until they were far enough ahead of the others that his voice would not carry. Tell me what happened, he said. She didn't answer immediately. She watched the terrain ahead, cataloging it the way she always did: exits, elevations, cover, and concealment, with the automatic thoroughness of someone whose survival had always depended on having that information current. Then, 20 minutes before the avalanche, I picked up a transmission on the emergency frequency. Not intended for me. The sender probably didn't know I was monitoring it. She paused. Someone gave our position in the pass. Grid coordinates, precise ones. More precise than satellite imagery alone would give you. The kind of precision that comes from someone who was in the briefing room when the movement plan was laid out. Harker felt the cold of it, which was a different kind of cold from the air. You know who, he said. I have a strong suspicion. She glanced at him. I need to confirm one more thing before I say a name. What thing? I'll know it when I see it. He thought about Decker. He ran the timeline backward. Decker at the briefing with no clear operational reason to be present. The GP's integrated tactical watch on Decker's wrist noticed and not acted on because adequate men sometimes acquired good equipment, and that alone was not a flag. The precise grid coordinates the transmission had apparently contained. How deep does it go, he asked. Nora was quiet. Ice crystals moved across the snow surface beside her boot. Decker is the mechanism I can prove, she said. The people above him, that's a different investigation. She paused. I'm a sniper. I deal in distances I can range. They reached the valley entrance at 1430. With Ghost of the Ridge no longer on the eastern rim, the corridor was simply a corridor 40 meters of open ground. They crossed in 20 seconds, spread wide and moving fast, coming out onto the valley floor with the observation post visible 200 meters ahead. Stone walls. A corrugated roof half collapsed under snow load. A chimney with a thin thread of smoke rising from it, pale against the white sky. Cole's Aldrich's people had fire. Aldrich's people were alive. Harker keyed the radio. Aldrich, this is Harker. We're on the valley floor 200 meters south of your position. Show me a signal. A flashlight blinked 3 times from the window slit of the observation post. Move up. They moved. During the approach, Nora dropped back slightly. Harker noticed but kept his pace. She was not retreating. She was watching something at the post, conducting an assessment that was deliberate and specific rather than general. He registered it and kept moving. At 40 meters, he heard her inhale. Short, controlled. The particular quality of a breath taken when certainty arrives rather than when uncertainty is being managed. He knocked on the stone wall with the butt of his rifle. The door, a warped wooden frame draped with a thermal blanket, opened, and Lieutenant Aldrich's face appeared. Frost burned, exhausted, with the expression of a man who has been running survival mathematics for 17 hours and has recently been forced to revise his estimate of the outcome. God, Aldrich said. Save it, Harker said. 4 bodies, 3 walking, wound situation. Marsh has a through and through in the upper left thigh. He's been keeping the fire. Lost some blood, but stable. The others are hypothermic, but functional. Thorne moved past Harker and into the post without being told. The others filed in. Harker stood in the doorway and looked back across the valley floor. Nora stood at the southern exterior wall of the post, very still. She was looking at Decker. Decker was standing near the eastern exterior wall, checking something on his weapon, a routine task that a man performs when he wants to appear occupied. He had not looked up when they entered. He had not acknowledged Nora. He had not shown the particular shock that every other team member had expressed when she appeared from the southern ridge. Most people, upon seeing Nora Vance emerge from a mountain they had presumed had killed her, spent at least 30 seconds working through the cognitive recalibration the sight required. Decker had not looked up. Not once. Harker stepped inside. The temperature in the post was barely above freezing, which felt tropical after the valley. A small fire burned in a stone ring, broken furniture, scraps of wood from a former storage shelf, burning down to the coal bed that sustained heat more reliably than flame. Marsh was propped against the far wall with his leg extended, watching Thorne work with the resigned composure of a man who has learned that staying still is his best contribution. Aldrich gave Harker the situation in flat economical sentences. Standard reconnaissance route, first contact from the eastern ridge without warning. Corporal Aldrin had gone down in the first-second single shot, no recovery. The element had gone to ground and stayed there for 4 days, unable to move without presenting targets. Rationing food, watching the radio battery die. We heard the shot, Aldrich said. The one that took Ghost down. I've been in these mountains for 2 deployments. I've never heard anything come from that direction or at that distance. I didn't understand it. Neither did we, Harker said. Not at first. Nora had come inside. She stood near the eastern wall, back against stone, the Russian rifle leaning against her right thigh. She was looking at Decker, who had positioned himself near the door, proximity to an exit. Probably unconscious, the body defaulting to tactics when the mind had other concerns. He was busy with something at his radio. He had not acknowledged Nora since they entered the post. Harker kept his voice conversational. When did you last update command with our approach route? Decker looked up. Standard confirmation signal during insertion, sir. That's SOP. What frequency? Primary tactical, sir. Primary tactical was compromised in the Nordavik incident, Nora said from the wall without inflection. We shifted to secondary for this mission. It was covered in the briefing. A pause. Just a beat too long, right, Decker said. Secondary, I misspoke. Nora's eye held on him. Your radio log will show which frequency the signal actually went on, not which frequency you said you used. Another pause. Longer. Decker set his weapon down. The motion was slow and deliberate, and it was not the motion of a man setting something down because he was tired of holding it. It was the motion of a man who has run a rapid assessment of his available options and concluded that the weapon is not his best one in this moment. Harker had seen that motion before. He recognized it now. Aldrich, he said quietly, take your people to the back corner. Aldrich was experienced. He didn't ask why. He moved his 3 walking personnel to the far end of the post with the efficient calm of someone who understands that when a team leader speaks in that register, questions are not the appropriate response. Decker Harker said, we need to talk about Nordvik. What happened next was fast, the way these things always are. Decker moved left toward the door, and he was quicker than 14 months of careful unremarkableness had suggested. He got the door open. He got 1 step outside into the cold. Then he stopped. Nora was already outside. She had moved before anyone in the post registered it around the exterior, through the gap in the rear wall across the snow-crusted ground, positioning herself 6 meters ahead of the door, in the time it had taken Decker to cross the interior and reach it. The Russian rifle was in her left hand, angled toward the ground, not raised. Her one functioning eye was on him with the same flat, steady quality it always held. Not angry, not performing anything for anyone present. Just there. You gave them our position, she said. Decker said nothing. His breath came fast and visible in the cold. You knew the pass. You knew the timing. You knew my hide position. Her voice carried the same precision she used for wind readings and distance calls, facts arranged in the order that made them comprehensible. They paid you to keep us in the pass long enough for the detonation to trigger. You transmitted our coordinates, and then you waited to see if the avalanche completed the work. You don't know that, Decker said. You're wearing a tactical watch I haven't seen before this mission, Nora said. Military-grade GPS integration with beacon functionality, the kind that transmits on a frequency that doesn't interfere with standard comms, but is detectable if you're monitoring the right channel. She paused. Ghost of the Ridge wasn't finding us by terrain analysis and pattern recognition. He was following your beacon. Decker's jaw tightened. You can't read a beacon frequency with field equipment. No, Nora said. But when you spent 3 nights at staging before the Nordavik mission, there was an intermittent bleed on the satellite uplink channel. 4-digit burst transmission every 12 hours. She tilted her head slightly. I ran the timing against Ghost's confirmed engagement windows over 8 weeks. They lined up exactly. Decker looked at the ground. Something in him that had been held at a certain tension went slack, not dramatically, but with the specific quality of a mechanism reaching the end of its functional range. How much, Harker said from the doorway. Silence. How much his voice was quiet. Anger would have been easier to manage. The quietness accumulated rather than peaked, and it had a patience to it that was worse than volume. Decker raised his eyes to Nora. He looked at the broken arm and the clean splint, at the sealed right eye, at the rifle in her left hand, and the 72 hours inscribed on every surface of her. He had sold coordinates and movement data and position reports. He had almost certainly not permitted himself to imagine the person at the end of those targeting packages. He was being required to imagine now in close range, and the imagination was costing him something visible. 6 figures, he said. American. Nobody spoke. I want a lawyer. You'll get one, Harker said. When we get back, which you should be grateful we're making possible. Decker looked at Nora again. Something moved across his face, not remorse exactly, but something adjacent. The discomfort of a man forced to look at the concrete result of a decision he had made in the abstract. You should have died, he said, not with cruelty, almost with wonder, the genuine incomprehension of someone looking at an outcome his planning had not accounted for. Nora looked at him with the one eye that worked. The rifle remained at her side, not raised. I know, she said. She said it simply. Without drama, without satisfaction, without any performance, the moment might have seemed to call for. I decided not to. Harker zip-tied Decker's wrists with the practiced efficiency of someone who has performed prisoner handling in field conditions more times than he would have preferred. Decker complied. His hands were steady, the equanimity of someone who has considered this possibility and arrived at a working accommodation with it. A gamble run and lost and filed accordingly. Harker walked him back inside. That night, the whiteout arrived in full force and was merciless. They burned everything combustible they could find. The fire stayed alive. All 9 people in that post. Harker's team. Aldrich's element, Decker zip-tied and separated against the far wall, stayed alive with it, cold and still, and very alive. Harker sat across the fire from Nora, and the orange light moved across her face and the frozen blood on her jaw looked almost black in it. Tell me about the 72 hours, he said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire rather than at him, organizing information in the order she intended to present it rather than requiring time to locate it. When the snow stopped moving, I was 12 meters below the ridgeline, she said. Partially buried torso and legs, not my head. The arm was already broken from the fall. The eye impact came from the pressure wave before I went off the ridge. Something hit the right side of my face at velocity. She looked at the fire. Digging out took approximately 30 minutes. The snowpack was dense but not fully consolidated. I had my hands free in the boot knife and I could work methodically. The radio was destroyed. The primary weapon was buried under the main slide mass. She paused. I had heard the transmission before the avalanche triggered. I knew the position had been compromised. I knew someone at staging level had access to our movement plan. She glanced at him. If I came back to staging without knowing who, I had no way to control what happened next. So you stayed in the field. I identified Ghost of the Ridge's secondary hide on the southern summit during a previous operation 2 weeks prior. I noted it as a contingency. The cached weapon was there. She looked down at Thorne's clean splint. I climbed to that position on the second day when the weather allowed movement. Established a position. Waited. She looked back up at him. You were going to come back. That valley had 4 people alive in it, and you were going to come for them regardless of what the weather said. A slight pause. I know how you think. He didn't say anything. Ghost of the Ridge had moved to his position on the eastern ridge the night before you arrived, she continued. I watched him establish it through the scope for 9 hours. I waited until he engaged, until he had committed to a stationary position with a defined target. Then I began the calculation. The crosswind at that distance and altitude creates a layered wind structure, she said. The temperature differential between the southern ridge and the eastern changes the wind vector at each altitude band. The round passes through multiple distinct layers over 3,300 meters. You don't compensate for the surface wind and apply it uniformly. You have to estimate each layer separately. She paused. I had most of the night to work the problem. Harker looked at her across the fire. One eye open, one sealed. Blood frozen on her jaw. The Russian rifle against the wall beside her, he looked at all of it and thought about the specific shape of what she had done, not the shot itself, which was extraordinary by any measure, but the decision-making that preceded it. The patient, methodical process of a person working through an impossible situation with the same operational clarity she brought to every other problem from a position of complete isolation with resources that should have been categorically insufficient. It was manageable, she said. The whiteout pressed against the post walls through the night. The fire burned down and they rebuilt it with the last of what was combustible, and it burned again. Outside, the mountain did what mountains do in serious weather. It asserted its own terms completely without negotiation, and the small fire in the stone ring was the only argument against those terms available to the 9 people gathered around it. In the pre-dawn hours when the storm had exhausted itself and the wind dropped to something merely brutal, Harker woke from the light, monitoring rest he'd managed and found the post quieter than it should have been. Nora was not inside. He went to the door and opened it. The cold arrived immediately, -26 and clear, with the crystalline quality that exists in mountain terrain after major weather has scoured everything soft away. The sky was not yet light but had reached the deep gray that precedes mountain dawn, where the world exists in outline rather than detail, and the snow gives back whatever light the sky provides. Nora was standing at the northern exterior wall of the post, completely still. The Russian rifle in her left hand angled toward the ground. She was looking north toward the valley entrance, toward the broken granite formations that marked the upper rim of the approach corridor. He went to her. "What is it?" he said quietly. Ghost of the Ridge was not a solo operator, she said without turning. He never was. The containment of Aldrich's element was too precise for one person to manage alone. A shooter at that distance cannot observe his own impacts in these conditions. He needs a forward observer, someone close enough to the target area to call adjustments and confirm results. Harker was already looking at the northern rim. "The forward observer has been on the northern rim since yesterday afternoon," Nora said. He held his position through the whiteout because moving in a Category 4 system at altitude is more dangerous than staying put. He watched us come in. He watched us bring out Decker. She paused. He's been waiting to see if the storm finished the rest. Harker reached for his radio. "Don't," she said quietly. "Any transmission confirms we're alive and in the post. If he's uncertain, we have a window." She tilted her chin toward a formation on the northern rim, a broken column of granite leaning east rising above the valley wall like a crooked finger. "He's behind that formation. He'll have to move before full daylight. When he does, he'll cross the skyline at the eastern edge for approximately 3 seconds. How long?" Harker said. "Long, Harker." 90 minutes to first light," she said. "He moves in the next 20 minutes or the visibility becomes a problem for him." He looked at her, at the arm in the white splint, at the sealed right eye, at the rifle in her left hand. 1,400 meters, he said, with one eye, with one arm, in pre-dawn light. "The rifle is a left-hand system," she said. "I've been shooting it left-handed since I found it. The arm doesn't have to support the weapon. It only has to stabilize. I have the rock." She gestured toward the exterior wall of the post, a flat section of stone at chest height, angled naturally toward the northern rim positioned by 10,000 years of geological indifference in a configuration that was for this specific purpose functionally ideal. "You've been setting this up," he said. "Since midnight," she said. "I positioned the support and ranged the formation while the storm was still covering movement." She paused, simply. "I had time." He was quiet. He thought about midnight, about Nora Vance standing outside in the full dark of a mountain whiteout in -26 degrees with a broken arm and one functioning eye ranging a target that didn't exist yet, preparing the geometry of a shot she wasn't certain she'd need to make. Because preparation was the only honest response to uncertainty. Because the situation might require this, and she intended to meet the situation regardless of what it required. He thought about what it cost a human body to do what she had done over the preceding 72 hours, not abstractly, not in the aggregate, but specifically hour by hour. The fall, the digging, the decision to stay in the field rather than risk returning to compromised staging. The climb on a broken arm, the 9 hours of watching through the scope, the calculation worked through a mountain night, the shot itself, the walk-in afterward, and then instead of the rest that the body was owed, this standing in the dark before dawn, preparing one more shot because the accounting wasn't finished yet. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Stay exactly where you are. Don't move. Don't make any sound. If he detects movement at the post level before he's committed to crossing, he'll abort and reposition, and we lose the window." She looked at him with the eye that was working, direct level without deflection. "When he crosses, I'll have 3 seconds." He stayed where he was. He did not move. He did not make any sound. Nora settled against the stone support. The Russian rifle went to her left shoulder with the careful deliberateness of someone managing a process that required precision over speed. Her right arm in its splint pressed against the stone surface, not gripping, just resting a counterweight, the broken radius contributing what it still could by being present and still. Her left eye found the scope. They waited. The sky continued to lighten by degrees, gray becoming pale, the mountains coming back from darkness into solid form, with the slowness that mountain dawns always carried the world returning to itself without hurry. The snow on the valley floor reflected the rising light and turned the air silver. The cold was absolute and quiet and very clean. At 6 minutes past the first definable moment of dawn, something moved on the northern rim. A shape, a silhouette, a man crossing the eastern edge of the broken granite formation at a crouch, moving with the economy of someone who believes the hard part is over. Moving in the particular way that people move when they've decided what remains is technical rather than critical. He was wrong about that. Nora clicked her tongue once, then twice. Then she fired. The sound left the post wall and rolled across the valley and was absorbed by the granite on all sides, rolling away into the distance, diminishing, gone. On the northern rim, the shape that had been a man crossing a skyline was no longer crossing it. The geometry of the thing resolved completely, and finally without drama, without anything the reality of it called for in terms of scale or ceremony. She lowered the rifle. She stepped back from the stone support. She stood for a moment in the careful stillness of someone conducting a specific inventory, and then she sat down in the snow. Not deliberately, not as a choice. The body's ledger had been accumulating entries for 72 hours, and the payment had arrived in a form that was not negotiable, and what remained of her operational reserves had been spent in the preceding 6 minutes at the stone support. Harker was beside her before the thought to move had fully completed itself. He sat down next to her in the snow, close enough that his shoulder was against hers, and he waited. The cold pressed up from the ground beneath them. The valley lay white and still and empty, and behind them the post held 8 living people, and 1 prisoner, small and solid and real against the surrounding granite. After a long moment, she said, "That's twice." He looked at her. "Twice what?" "Twice I've sat down in the snow without meaning to." A pause. "I dislike it, I know," he said. The sun came up the way mountain suns come up after serious weather, not quickly, not dramatically, but with a growing intensity that was almost physical. It came over the eastern ridge and lay gold and orange across the valley floor and turned the snowfield into something that required some effort to look at directly. Each crystal contributed its fraction of reflected light to an aggregate brightness that made the world seem briefly like a place where warmth was permanent rather than exceptional. Nora sat with her shoulder against his and watched it. Her left eye was open. Her breathing was slow and controlled. The Russian rifle lay across her knees in the early stillness of a mountain morning after weather occupied all the space the wind had vacated. "You're going to need surgery on the arm," Harker said. "I know. And the eye. I know. They'll ground you." She was quiet for what he estimated as 15 seconds. "Temporarily," she said. He didn't argue. He had learned over 4 years that some conclusions were not worth contesting, not because the contest couldn't be made on technical grounds, but because the person who had arrived at the conclusion had done so through a process that was not accessible to external revision. They sat in the snow, and the sun climbed another degree above the ridgeline, and the valley was gold and still, and the accounting of what had happened here over the preceding 72 hours had the quality now of something the landscape had already absorbed. The second helicopter appeared at the valley entrance at 9 in the morning. 2 aircraft working the improved visibility with the efficiency of crews that had been waiting for weather and are now executing without delay. Aldrich's people went first. Marsh on a litter handled with the care a thigh wound required after extended cold exposure. The other 2 walking, moving with the slightly mechanical gait of people who have been cold long enough that their bodies are still remembering warmth is available. Then Decker cuffed and under Briggs's direct supervision. His face carried the expression of a man who has accepted the arithmetic of a situation and is waiting for the process to proceed. As he passed, Harker noticed that he did not look at Nora, and Nora did not look at him. There was nothing unfinished between them. The accounting was complete on both sides. Harker sent his own team on the second aircraft and then stood outside the post for a final moment in the cold morning air. North, then south, then at the sky, the deep specific blue of high altitude, after a storm has taken everything turbulent with it and left only clarity. The kind of blue that made the mountains look cut from something harder than rock. He walked back through the valley floor, through the northern corridor, north along the base of the western cliffs, following a route he had walked once before in a different operational state with a different weight in his chest. He walked for 2 kilometers until the terrain opened and the path curved east toward the Nordvik Pass. He walked through the pass. He found the place. The knife was still there. The K-bar blade down in the ice handle, pointing at the sky exactly where he had left it. The snow around it had shifted and settled, and shifted again through 72 hours of serious weather, and the mound that had been identifiable as a mound 3 days ago was no longer. The surface was irregular, the way all mountain snowfields were irregular, a slightly uneven plain that gave no indication of what lay beneath or what had once been presumed to lie beneath. If you didn't know what to look for, you would walk past without any particular attention. Harker crouched beside the knife. He looked at it for a while without moving. He had performed field burials before. Not formal ones, blade-down markers, the quiet things said, when there was no chaplain and no time, and nothing available except the acknowledgement that someone had been here and was no longer. He knew the ritual because he had developed it and performed it and carried it forward as the only honest response to that specific wait. He knew what it cost to stand up afterward and turn away. What he did not have a framework for was this. She had been alive in the snow when he drove the knife in, 12 meters below the ridgeline, arm already broken, working through compacted ice with a boot knife and one functional hand in the silence and the dark while 7 men stood above her and performed the ceremony of her death. The knife had gone into the ground over nothing. The mound had looked like a mound. The grief had been fully experienced and had applied to no one. He did not know what to do with that. In 15 years, he had built the specific capacity required to carry loss. You developed it through repeated exposure until the weight became something you managed rather than something that managed you. What nobody had prepared him for was the ones who climbed out. The ones who took their death back with them and left you holding grief with nothing to attach it to. He thought about Decker's wonder. You should have died. The genuine incomprehension of a man looking at an outcome his planning had not accounted for. And her answer delivered with the same flat certainty she used for everything. I know. I decided not to. He had heard a great many things said in a great many difficult places over 15 years. He had a reliable sense by now of which ones stayed in the accessible part of memory and which ones settled into the background, accumulation of experience you carried without thinking about it. He would not be filing that one in the background. He reached down and pulled the knife out of the ice. The blade came free with the resistance of something held by frozen ground for 3 days and now releasing. He wiped the blade on his sleeve, the way he always did, and looked at the small compass etched into the pommel, catching the cold morning light throwing a pale reflection across the featureless white. He had left a knife like this in the ground once before in a different mountain range and had not gone back for it. He was retrieving this one. He had known he would when he drove it in 3 days ago and had not been able to explain the knowing at the time and understood now that it had been the only accurate read he had made of the entire situation that somewhere below him the mountain was not keeping what it had been given. He slid the knife back into its sheath. He stood. The snowfield stretched in every direction, unmarked and different, wearing its silence the way it wore everything completely and without comment. The slight disturbance of his boot prints would smooth under wind-driven powder within the hour. Within the day, there would be nothing here at all. The mountain would carry its record of what had happened in the only language it used, which no living person had ever learned to read. He turned and walked back toward the extraction point. He was 50 meters into the pass when he heard it. He stopped. 2 short pulses. A pause. 1 long. A pause. 2 short. He turned around. The pass behind him was empty. The snowfield was white and unmarked and still. The sky above the ridgeline was the deep clear blue of the post-storm morning. No wind, no movement, no shape on any ridgeline that his eyes could locate. Nothing. He stood facing the empty pass for 30 seconds and listened with the full attention of a man who has learned that the things he cannot explain have often been the most reliable information available to him. He listened carefully and thoroughly. Silence. Then he turned back around and kept walking. He found Nora at the extraction point. She was seated on a gear case with the Russian rifle across her knees, broken down for field cleaning. The components were laid out on a thermal blanket in the precise order that efficient reassembly required each piece in its correct position. Nothing out of sequence, the same care applied to an enemy weapon she had carried for less than 2 days as she would have applied to her own. She was working left-handed, her right arm in the white splint, moving through the process without hurrying, fitting each piece to the next, with the accuracy of someone who has transferred competency completely across systems. Harker sat down on a gear case across from her. The clearing was quiet. The sky above it was the blue of high altitude in the late morning after serious weather clarity, of the kind that feels like something has been cleaned away that had been accumulating for a long time. The empty grave, he said. She looked up from the rifle. Your mound, he said. I was just there. There's nothing. You'd never know anyone had been there. She looked at him steadily with the eye that was working. Were you expecting something? He considered the question honestly. I don't know, he said. She returned to the rifle. She seated the suppressor, checked the bolt with her thumb, set the assembled weapon on the case beside her. I was there for 72 hours, she said, under the snow for approximately 2 of them. She paused. The other 70 I was somewhere else. Where, he said. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the mountain above the clearing, the peak that had been obscured by weather for 3 days and was now visible in the post-storm clarity, white and enormous against the blue sky, wearing its permanence without comment. Up, she said. She said it simply. No elaboration, no invitation to press further. Exactly as many words as the situation required. They sat in the silence and let the cold and the light and the high clean air exist around them without trying to do anything with it. Two people in a clearing at the edge of a valley where something had happened and something else had been prevented, and the full accounting of both was not yet complete and in some significant respects never would be. The sound of rotors came from the south. The second helicopter working the improved conditions with the efficiency of a crew that has been waiting and is now executing without delay. Growing from a small dark shape against the blue into something large and loud, the rotor wash preceding it into the clearing and pushing a wave of fine powder outward in an expanding circle that caught the light and dissolved. Nora stood. She slung the Russian rifle across her back, left side good arm through the strap. She adjusted the carry position with the economy of movement that was simply how she existed in an operational environment. No excess, no gesture without purpose. Every adjustment made once and correctly. Then she stopped. She looked at him. Harker, she said. He looked at her, at the sealed right eye and the clean white splint and the frozen blood still on her jaw. At the 72 hours written on her in the way that particular experiences write themselves on people who survive them. Not dramatically, not obviously to anyone who hadn't been paying attention, but completely legible to anyone who had. I want the H&H back, she said. He looked at her for a moment. When the snow thaws, there won't be much left, he said. The case was destroyed. The stock was shattered. The barrel will be fine, she said. And the action. She looked at him with the one eye that was working direct and undeflected. I want it back. He thought about the knife in the ice and the mound that was empty and the sound in the past that had come from nothing and resolved to nothing. He thought about 3,340 meters in a crosswind with one eye and a broken arm calculated through a mountain night in the dark. He thought about what it meant to know, with operational certainty, with the kind of certainty that a person acts on without confirmation how someone else thought. All right, he said. She nodded. Once. Then she walked toward the helicopter, steadier than she had been. Not the fluid ground-covering efficiency he knew from 4 years of watching her move through terrain, but steady, and the steadiness carried the same quality it always had. Not performance, not effort for display, but simply what she was. The rotor wash hit full force as she reached the door. Snow and ice crystals whirled outward in an expanding circle, and she stood at the center of it with the stillness of someone who has been in worse, and then she climbed in without looking back and the door closed. The helicopter lifted. Harker stood in the clearing and watched it rise above the ridgeline and become a small, dark shape against the blue, and then become the sound of rotors fading, and then become the silence after rotors have faded, which is a specific kind of silence, not empty but recently vacated, carrying the shape of what was just in it. He stood there until the sound was completely gone and the silence of the mountain had reasserted itself fully, and the place where the helicopter had been was just a clearing with snow disturbed by rotor wash that the wind would smooth within the hour. Then he walked to the extraction point and waited for the next aircraft. 6 months later, at an address not in any directory, and that Harker had changed twice in the preceding year for reasons not unrelated to the events in the Hardick Range, a package arrived. Small, wrapped plainly, no return address. The postmark was from a city he didn't immediately recognize in a region he knew only by its general operational geography. A city far from any mountain, far from any Hess, in a place where the snow, if it fell at all, did not fall the way it fell in the Hardick Range. He opened it at his desk. Inside, cushioned in a fold of plain cloth, was a single cartridge. 338 Lapua Magnum. The brass was clean, unfired, perfect. No note, nothing in the packaging that identified the sender or explained the cartridge or offered any context for why it had arrived or what it was intended to communicate. Harker held it in his open palm and looked at it for a long time. He didn't need a note. He knew the caliber. He knew the weapon it had come from, or one identical to it, the Russian platform that had spent 6 weeks in a secondary hide on a southern summit, waiting for a shooter who wasn't supposed to be alive to climb up and find it. He knew the distance at which that cartridge, or one exactly like it, had traveled through layered mountain wind across 3,340 meters and ended the operational career of a man who had believed himself unfindable. He knew what the calculation behind that shot had required and how long it had taken and under what conditions it had been performed. He knew who had sent it, underscented. He closed his hand around the cartridge. There were people who did this work and came home afterward, carrying what they carried, finding ways to set it down in the places and among the people who made that possible. There were people who did this work and found at some point they couldn't precisely locate that the distinction between the work and everything else had disappeared, that the operational life and the rest of it had merged somewhere behind them and couldn't now be separated. And there was a third kind, people who did this work the way the work needed to be done, which was completely and without reservation and without expectation that the doing of it would be witnessed or acknowledged beyond the operational necessity of having done it. People who climbed out of the snow on a broken arm because the situation required it, who made the shot because the situation required it, who sat down in the snow afterward because the body required it and then stood up again because the situation was not yet finished requiring things. People who sent a single cartridge across 6 months and several hundred miles with no note and no explanation, because no note was needed and no explanation would add anything to what the cartridge itself already said. He carried it to his desk and set it upright on the surface in front of him. He sat down and looked at it in the quiet of the room. Outside, the day was proceeding the way days proceeded in ordinary places. Traffic on the street below, wind through trees that were not mountain trees, light coming through the window at the angle it came through in this city at this time of year. None of it had the specific quality that light had at altitude after a major storm had passed, and the air had been cleaned of everything soft. The cartridge stood on his desk and said what it said. He had made Nora Vance a promise in a helicopter clearing on the morning after a mountain whiteout. He had said all right. He had meant it the way he meant operational commitments, completely without a timeline, with the understanding that the how was a problem to be solved and the weather was already settled. The H&H 408 was under compacted snow and ice in the Nordvik Pass, in the place where a mound had been and was no longer. The stock was shattered. The case was destroyed. Most of the external components had been compromised beyond recovery, but the barrel would be fine. The action would survive the winter. The things that made it what it was would be there when the snow gave them back. When the snow thawed, someone would go back. He would make sure of it. He looked at the cartridge on his desk and thought about a snowfield and a mountain pass, unmarked, indifferent, carrying its record in the only language it used. He thought about a knife retrieved from frozen ground and the particular weight of an empty grave, not the weight of loss, which he knew, but the weight of finding out that what you mourned had not been lost at all. He thought about the sound in the past, too short and one long, and too short, which had come from nothing and resolved to nothing, and which he had spent 6 months deciding whether to trust. He had decided to trust it. He reached into his desk drawer and found a small flat box, the kind used for preserving items that needed to be kept but not displayed. He set the cartridge inside with the care he brought to things that were irreplaceable. Then he closed the box and placed it in the drawer and closed the drawer. There were things you carried in the accessible part and things you carried in the part below it. He had been for 15 years in the business of making those determinations accurately. The cartridge went in the accessible part. The empty grave went in the accessible part. The specific quality of Nora Vance's voice saying, "I decided not to," with the flat certainty she brought to everything she was sure of, that went in the accessible part. He would not be excavating those. He would simply look at them when he needed to. Outside, the day continued. The mountain somewhere far to the north held its silence. It had seen everything that had happened in the Nordvik Pass, in the Hardik Valley, in the southern summit, in the hollow in the cliff face, and it carried its record the way it carried everything permanently, without sentiment, in a language that admitted no interpretation. But the story had left the mountain now. It lived in 7 people who had been flat in the snow when the shot came from the wrong direction and had understood each in their own way and at their own pace what that meant. It lived in Lieutenant Aldrich, who had been in those mountains for 2 deployments and had never heard a shot come from that distance or that direction, and who would carry the specific quality of that sound for the rest of his life. It lived in Kowalski, who had said you cannot make that shot with complete technical certainty and had been completely wrong. It lived in Garrett the youngest, who had not yet learned to keep his attention off his face and whose face in the hollow had carried the open expression of someone watching something happen that would become a fixed point in his understanding of what people were capable of. It lived in Harker, and it lived presumably in Nora Vance, wherever she was, whatever she was doing in the 6 months since a helicopter had lifted her out of a valley that had tried to keep her. Recovering, presumably. Enduring the surgeries and the physical therapy and the medical opinions about what she could and couldn't do with the same flat, uninterested brevity she brought to all personal information. Filing the temporary in the same place she filed everything that was not immediately operational. Waiting. A single cartridge sent across 6 months with no note. She had told him in the hollow that she had stayed in the field because she hadn't known who to trust. She had told him at the fire that the other 70 hours she had been somewhere up. She had told him at the extraction point that she wanted the rifle back. Those were the words she had used, no more and no fewer than the situation required. He understood all of them completely. There was a sniper. They buried her in the snow. Then she came back.